Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we are going to talk more about the story. So, we're still continuing on our debates and on our understanding of what we actually mean by the research process and why we do research. And as the trademark of this video and this site and this channel, we always try to bring the Native African experience and try to explain how Africans have been seeing the world from a research perspective. So my hope is that this is going to help people, particularly people who are interested in doing research on the African continent, to understand how particular stories and particular ways have been formed. So in the previous lesson, we talked about aspects related to the truth, why we search for the truth, what it means to tell the truth. We deplored the idea of saying one person has the truth, and we explained this to be a result of different levels of consciousness and how people report consciousness. So, in our previous lesson, we got to a point where we noted that the individual lived in a society. And because the individual lives in a society, there is need for communication between different members of the society. This we call the communication problem. So, the communication problem we solved and explained to be best dealt with using third party consciousness narratives. But now, a combination of multiple third party consciousness narratives creates different stories from which we draw or understand reality. So, this lesson is going to be mostly talking about how these stories have been formulated and how important these stories are. And we're also going to delve into ideas from historical analysis on how different stories have been used to control society, to control reality, and to mold the very people who we are. That was what we termed the communication problem. So, getting into what we are dealing with today, what is a story? What do we mean by a story? The different ways in which people see reality usually affect the way they are able to relate. There are a lot of allegations that most males are objective in nature and they struggle to deal with females who usually feel things and want to communicate the feeling of the way they see reality. And when objectivity and that subjective experience do not come together, people tend not to understand each other. But is it only females? No. Most of us, all of us actually have all three forms of consciousness. I've already explained this. So what does it mean? How do we have such different views and different stories that govern our reality? So in order to talk about this, I want to bring in something that maybe I'm sure some of you have heard about it. I'll leave some notes on it. We argue that in physics, modern physics, matter is built using small breaks of quanta which emerge from a quantum vacuum. So these bricks of quanta are the ones that give us the stable picture of reality of matter that we see. From the other dimension of thought and mind, we argue that the small building blocks of reality as we see it are what we call qualia. Qualia are the small building blocks of reality, and we all experience qualia every minute, every moment, every day. Those snapshots of reality, the feelings that you get when you are in the sun, when you hear the wind, when you feel the wind on your skin, those multiple subjective experiences are what we call qualia. And reality is built from those multiple subjective experiences that we all feel. Now, this is where the challenge comes, as I noted earlier on in the previous lesson. How do we report these subjective feelings to other people without misrepresenting what we felt? And we noted that because the research method is predominantly based on third party experiences, there have been attempts to solve this problem. But one of the best ways is to tell a story. What would be the story? So the story simply argues that because all of us have got subjective experiences and all of us have got qualia that build our reality, it should follow that at least there should be some qualia that we all experienced. What do I mean? We reduce the multiple subjective experiences to those things that are common to all the people who experienced this particular thing. For instance, the last week we spoke about tasting honey. We said no matter how much you are told about honey. Until you taste it, you do not know how honey tastes. But in the process of tasting honey, you are within the environment, you are being stung by bees, you are feeling the wind on your face, you are feeling so many things around you. But we are confident that if all of us tasted the honey, then we should have had a significant experience around the honey. And if all of us were stung by the bees as we're tasting honey, it is a qualia that occurred to all of us. Therefore, when we tell the story about honey, we're able to reduce it to say only two aspects. You'll see in the narrative that I put up as well on my website, that is thenativeresearcher.com, the Evitan, that will be the evitan.com, where we discuss aspects of native researcher. You can go and visit that. I also put a link up to it. I explain that these two experiences that we all felt end up being used as the narrative summary of what it means to go and harvest honey. So when we ask people, what does it mean to go and harvest honey? They'll say no. Going to harvest honey means being stung by bees, but enjoying the sweet taste of honey. All the other experiences that we may have had as individuals are suddenly reduced to this common narrative, the main story. And this story becomes very powerful because it is linked to everyone who was part of that harvesting process. And as it is linked to everyone who was part of that harvesting process, it becomes the dominant narrative which creates what we end up calling objectivity. We end up saying the objective truth is that honey is sweet and bees sting you when you attempt to harvest it. This is how the story is built. From reducing and cutting up small pieces of realities into things or a series of events that we experience as a group. So we remove all the juicy bits and all the pieces and the what we felt, the happiness and so on, until we get a singular story that we all agree to and abide by. But does this mean we did not experience anything different from the story? No. It means that those experiences are outside what we all experienced. So those qualia, we end up throwing them away. And we use the qualia to build the reality that fits what we are looking for. Now, this is how a powerful story is built. So the challenge becomes, therefore, anything else that you experience that is outside the story, we end up not being interested in it, no matter how real it is to you. This is where the communication divide I was speaking of between people who are first-party consciousness-based are. They want to tell you about their deep feelings, but you are a third-party person who is interested in the story that has been created by multiple deep feelings, and we have reduced it for those that are significant. So you will not understand each other, because whatever this person could be saying may have elements that are outside the dominant narrative that says honey is sweet and bees sting when you harvest honey. You see? So now you end up fighting with this person who's telling you, no. The sound of bees makes me feel scared. Then you say, that is not in the story. We are not interested in that. That is not objective. Those are your own feelings. Deal with them. You have a problem with that person now because they think you are insensitive. And it is true you are insensitive because you have moved away from the basic first-party experiences and you have chosen to deal with the dominant narrative. Now, you have to realize that this official communication that we would have naturally is the one that tends to shape the human beings who we produce, the children. It becomes the ways in which socialization is conducted. It becomes the dominant narrative that we tell every child as they grow up. Do not do this because of that. Do not do this because of that. This is the story of this. This is the story of that. So children are bound to see things around them in that particular perspective. But there come times when one child, for some reason maybe, comes across some bees that are producing sour honey. Very, very sour honey. This is a subjective experience. Now, the bees could be tasting sour because maybe the child's taste buds have a problem, or they're actually producing sour honey. But the child comes home, reports this to the parents, I tasted sour honey. Everyone laughs at him because it is outside the dominant narrative. So the children are quickly taught to keep things within the general narrative and the dominant narrative. Anything else that you experience that is outside that, no, we're not interested. But there are times when the honey becomes too sour. What do I mean? Right. These stories have been the source of a lot of power. And naturally, because the storyteller is telling the story, that storyteller gains a lot of power, gains a lot of power on the society that they're telling the story. And every time when the storyteller tells us the story, everyone believes it. Everyone believes it. Hence, the storyteller can get all these people to do anything else that they want. Now, in the past, and as time went on, as humanity became more complex, people started to tell major and big stories and record them and reduce them into dominant narratives. And this started to form the dogmatic ideas of religion and other ideas of where life came from and so on. Now, naturally, religion was the main way that we started seeing the world. It had so much power. The story was so powerful, and it reduced specific qualia about how we experience life. Specific qualia about how we experience life reduced them to particular writings, which they packaged in a particular code. And in some religions, the Christian religions will have the Bible, and the Muslim religions will have the Quran, and so on and so on. Put them in this code that became the dominant narrative of what the truth was. So it was very difficult to argue with this. So anyone who came up with something that was different, they had a different experience from what the religious text said. It was very difficult to believe these people, to say anything about them. They were usually ridiculed and in most cases even punished. You remember the ideas of the Spanish Inquisitions and the General Inquisition process, people who were considered to be heretics. Anyone who did not abide by the dominant narrative was crushed for almost 2 centuries. But sometimes the honey really becomes really sour. And we start to see that, okay, no, something is wrong. When we base a story based on common qualia, it usually stands very well. But when we start adding to the story because we become so powerful, using our imagination, it's only a matter of time before the honey becomes very, very sour. So religion naturally did this because they're very powerful. They started adding the imaginative side to the story. What happens when someone dies? How was the earth created? These were all first-party ideas of imagination, which did not have supportive qualia. You see? But because of the power of the story, it was possible to do this, but only up to a certain point. Now, enter someone very different who tasted that the honey was actually indeed not that sweet. Nicolaus Copernicus comes in, a Polish astronomer, and makes the argument that no, it is not true that the sun is outside the solar system and the earth is in the center. It is actually the sun that is in the center of all the universe. This was very, very uncomfortable for the religious circles who were actually saying the earth was in the center of the idea of the universe, rather. So saying this by Nicolaus Copernicus was very dangerous. Worse, there were people who actually worshipped the sun and they could not have it. So the ideas of Nicolaus Copernicus were actually thrown to the section of the Roman Catholic Church libraries where you were forbidden to read. Then it was thrown away, forgotten, just like heretics were thrown away. But now, Galileo Galilei comes and modifies the telescope that had already been invented by the Dutch. And he actually observes this phenomenon with the telescope. Now you can imagine he probably called a lot of people as well. Suddenly, we move away from the process of imagination. Because imagination was giving us a perception of the world, and we get into the base realm again of qualia. Galileo allowed people to experience the universe using the telescope. So they experienced this and saw this. And actually, the experience of qualia started to allow for the questioning of the perception of imagination. So Galileo said no, he supported Nicolaus Copernicus. Pope Paul V actually summoned him to Rome and told him that he should stop supporting this person. Galileo, naturally, because he felt he had got something amazing and he had support for the local royalty, decided against this. And he was convicted on the suspicion of heresy and spent almost 7 years in house arrest because of that. But still, even when he was convicted, he still maintained the idea that the sun was in the center of the universe. This was the birth of the objective process, where we stopped looking at imaginative ideas and started to focus on what was actually verifiable using multiple qualia. So, for this reason, Galileo is normally considered the father of the scientific method. But the scientific method, therefore, moved away totally, almost totally, from the ideas of first party experience. There is imagination, feeling, and so on. And they argue that unless we do it like Galileo, where we can prove it and see it, particularly with our sensory organs, the five senses, then it should not be there. This gave birth to the sensory based scientific method. The idea that if we cannot count it, calculate it, see, then it should not be there. This sensory based methodology of doing science or looking at reality dominated the world for a very, very long time, such that subjectivity became a very bad word in science. We could not talk about subjective experiences. If we could not experience it from our senses, then it was wrong. But this robbed science of the reality of humanity, because humanity experiences these things. Humanity experiences all these feelings, but science focused itself on what we now call sensory-based methodology or quantitative methodology. So the scientist slowly started to take the place of the religious actor. The scientist became the New Age priest, the New Age pope, the New Age pastor, explaining how to observe reality using universal qualia. And these universal qualia are those that were selected from the sensory organs only. So the scientist became the major storyteller who told you exactly which qualia qualified to be in the major story. And this is what the researcher became, explaining the research method. But it wasn't long before people started saying, no. Yes, I see the beauty of a flower. I see my favorite team scoring in a football game. And I have to explain what this does to me, how this makes me behave. I cannot ignore these things. So this gave birth to an alternative dimension of the scientific method, which we normally call qualitative analysis today, which argued that there should be a way, which may be not as stable or not as cast in stone as the sensory organ way, that allows us to experience or put the particular qualia related to first party experiences that allow us to explain the ways in which human beings behave. This brought about the qualitative method, where we say we have a selected group of qualia, that is small pieces of reality that we use to try and understand the reasons why human beings feel certain things after observation of particular phenomenon. So, because it came later and it's a secondary dimension of observation through the five senses, for a long time qualitative research played second fiddle to the sensory organs. But with time, we could no longer ignore the importance of aspects such as politics, economics, and so on. They started being massively analyzed from a dogmatic qualitative dimension. So these two ways have become the general ways in which we look at the scientific method from a qualitative, from a quantitative dimension. It is not that any is more superior than the other, because each of them are trying to tell a third-party based truth of what is actually occurring. Now, what does this mean for the African? I always have to come back and put this in the space in which we find ourselves. So the African also has multiple sensory-based qualia, also has multiple subjective-based qualia. But what has happened? The African has not been in a position to be able to assemble these qualia in such a way that they can tell a story that is convincing to the world. For example, the marriage institution is a very important institution for the progeneration of our species. But the qualia of what the marriage institution means for a very long time to the African was one based in a situation where polygamy was the dominant methodology. But faced with a situation where qualia from Europe that supported monogamy came into place, the African story started to crumble. I'm not saying I support this or I support that, but I'm just trying to show you how stories can crumble because the qualia that have been used to create them maybe are not strong enough, maybe are not well thought out, or maybe are not well gazetted. So it is critical that as we tell the African story, we are able to put it in such a way that those that are listening to us look at it from a third-party consciousness perspective and accept that it is a universal story that has got qualia that are common around multiple people in that particular society. And then we can use this as a methodology to build what we would call the dominant African narrative, which at this moment is still not very strong because the narrative that we're pushing is generally a Eurocentric narrative. As a result, most of the narratives that actually make sense in the ways in which we see people, see the world, see reality as Africans, tend not to be looked at. So it is important to start understanding things from that dimension. So even those who want to do research on the African continent are able to understand the various qualia that are common to the African people. Right, in the next lesson, I'm going to talk a bit about how this scientific method has evolved, the general philosophies that touch on both ideas of the qualitative qualia and the sensory-based quantitative qualia, what we know about them, and how we have put them together, and how we have created what we now call the gates of qualia that can enter the scientific or the research method in order to be considered good enough to tell an effective story.